In this video, we're going to talk about how to find the inverse of a function. Now, remember, in order for a function to have an inverse that's a function, right, instead of just a relation, in order to have an inverse function, the original function has to be 1-to-1, right? Its graph has to pass the horizontal line test. Okay, but if you do have a function that's 1-to-1, and you have maybe a formula for this function f, how do we find a formula for the inverse function? Okay, how do we find a formula for f inverse of x? Okay, well, to find a formula, or to find the inverse of a 1-to-1 function f, follow these 4 steps. Okay, and it's pretty simple here. First of all, you just replace f of x with y. Okay, then you interchange the roles of x and y. So everywhere you see an x, put a y. Everywhere you see a y, put an x. You're just flipping the roles of x and y. Okay, the third step, and this is the only step that could be hard out of all the steps, is to solve for y. Get y all by itself on one side of the equation with only x's on the other side. And the last step is to replace y with f inverse of x. And by the way, the inverse part is where you're flipping the roles of x and y, right? Step 2. Okay, so how do we do this? How do we find a formula for f inverse of x? Oh, and by the way, this is the notation that we use for f inverse of x. This does not mean f to the -1 power. It's kind of confusing. We just say f inverse of x. So how do we find a formula for the inverse function, okay, f inverse of x, if this is our original function? Okay, f of x equals 1/2 x cubed plus 5. Well, remember, the first step is to replace f of x with y. So we have y equals 1/2 x cubed plus 5. Okay, so we're just using y instead of f of x. Okay, the second step is to interchange x and y. So everywhere we see an x, put a y. Everywhere we see a y, put an x. Okay, so we have x equals 1/2 y cubed plus 5. Now the third step is to solve for y. So first of all, we'll subtract 5 from both sides. We get x minus 5 equals 1/2 y cubed. Okay, then we'll multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of the 1/2. So we'll multiply both sides by 2 here. And if we distribute the 2, we'll get 2x minus 10 equals just y cubed. Right, the 2 and the 1/2 multiply to be 1. Okay, so what is y equal to? Y will be equal to the cube root. Okay, the cube root of 2x minus 10. Or another way of writing this would be 2x minus 10 to the 1/3 power. Okay, so we get the cube root of 2x minus 10. Now the last step is to replace y with f inverse of x. Okay, so we have f inverse of x equals the cube root of 2x minus 10. Okay, so notice our 4 steps. First step's always easy. Just replace f of x with y. That's easy. Second step's also very easy. Just flip the roles of x and y. Everywhere you see an x, put a y. Everywhere you see y, put an x. Now the third step can be hard. In this case, it wasn't too bad, but we had to solve for y. We had to get y all by itself on one side of the equation. So we had to subtract 5 from both sides, then multiply both sides by 2, and then take the cube root. And what we ended up with was this. Y equals the cube root of 2x minus 10. And then the last step's easy. We replace y with f inverse of x. So here's our formula for f inverse of x. Now let's look at this graphically. First of all, in the purple we have our original function y equals 1/2 x cubed plus 5, and notice it passes the horizontal line test. If we zoomed out enough, we could see it passes the horizontal line test. And then I graphed f inverse here in black. Now I called it g because I couldn't figure out how to write f inverse here, but this is f inverse, the cube root of 2x minus 10. And notice it's the reflection of the original graph across this line y equals x. Okay, so f and f inverse are reflections of each other across that line. And by the way, the fact that your original function passed the horizontal line test, that it was 1-to-1, that meant that our inverse function is actually going to be a function, right? It'll pass the vertical line test. Okay, so that's why we needed our original function to be 1-to-1 in order to have to have an inverse function. So that's how you find the formula for the inverse function. You follow those 4 steps. And just for your reference, here are those 4 steps. So you might want to just pause the video and write these 4 steps down.